Put your sword back into its place, for all those who live by the sword will die by the sword. Matthew 26:52. Dear Lord, in the quietness of our hearts, we contemplate the profound truth that those who live by the sword die by the sword. In humility, we recognize that the truth that violence we project over others only serves to invite harm upon ourselves. It's a cycle of brutality that contradicts the essence of your kingdom. Teach us, Lord, to be architects of peace, to use our words and deeds to build up rather than tear down. May our legacy be one of encouragement, healing, and unity, reflecting your love and grace. Grant us the wisdom to understand the power of our influence, choosing to bless instead of curse, to embrace instead of exclude. Help us to see your image in every person, treating all with dignity and compassion. In this, let us mirror the heart of Jesus, who laid down his life to lift us up. Amen. Thank you for praying with me today. You're listening to the Jesus Podcast. Epic stories from the gospel, retold with dramatic tension and deep contemplation. Remain here to listen to the often untold story of Malchus. His story mirrors many who have been hurt by the followers of Jesus and require healing. Follow this podcast on whatever platform you're listening to. Doing so will keep you updated, but also help us get discovered by more people. We want the story of Jesus to be known throughout the world. Thanks for making that possible.
Jesus will be in the Garden of Gethsemane in just a few hours. He's finishing a meal with the rest of his followers. He'll take them there to pray. I don't know his plans after that, so we must move swiftly.
Half of Judas' face was hidden in shadows, and the other half illuminated by flickering torchlight. His hands shook slightly as he stood before the high priest Caiaphas. He had already accepted the silver. Now it was time to give Jesus up completely.
Give me a small company of guards. I'm sure he'll go quietly. He wouldn't dare make a scene.
Caiaphas leaned over his desk.
I once saw a crowd of nearly 10,000 people gather to see him preach. I refuse to take any chances by sending a few soldiers. The entire temple guard will leave with you. 300 armed men should be enough.
Caiaphas gestured to a servant.
Malchus, see to it that every man is armed with a sword. Tell them to bring plenty of torches. I want his followers to scurry like rats when they see you approaching.
Malchus was a young man with ruddy hair. His beard was barely grown, but his eyes were intense and confident. He stood up straight and bowed his head to Caiaphas.
As you wish, High Priest Caiaphas, it shall be done.
Malchus turned with Judas to gather the detachment of soldiers. A few other of the temple servants trailed behind. But before they exited the hall, Caiaphas added,
Malchus, this task is of great importance to the sanctity of this temple, the law of Moses, and Adonai. Do not fail.
Malchus bowed his head again.
Yes, Lord Caiaphas.
The young man escorted Judas out of the room. Together they gathered the detachment of temple guards and soldiers. It was a small army, armed and ready to arrest Jesus. Malchus was perturbed that one man had caused such a commotion. The angry rants of his master had seeped into his heart as well.
Seems excessive for just one man,
Malchus murmured. Judas' eyes darted sideways.
He isn't just a man.
Malchus waved off the comment. He was a devoted follower of the temple. An enemy of the temple was an enemy of his. The soldiers armed themselves, lit their torches, and marched toward the Mount of Olives. Storm clouds swirled above them, like dark vultures preparing to descend. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking their chests as they marched upward. Malchus walked beside them. Caiaphas' venomous words echoed in the chambers of his mind. Who were they about to arrest? A harmless rabbi? Or a dangerous criminal?
When God made mankind, He made us in His image. He designed us to be representatives of His character and His nature. But with the fall of man, sin was swept across God's good creation like a swarm of locusts. And as a result, God's greatest creation, us, was fractured. And though we may still be made in God's image, the ugliness of sin finds ways to slip through the cracks. But Jesus can mend us and heal us from all of our hurt. Welcome to the Jesus Podcast, gospel stories told with cinematic flair and honest reflection. I'm Zach, your host from pray.com, and I'm stoked to be back with you. We're nearing the end of our stories of Jesus and the outcasts, so make sure to follow the podcast and stick around so that you get to finish. Today's epic narrative begins after a quiet night of prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus and his disciples have settled into the upper room of a home in Jerusalem. He washes their feet, demonstrating his humble servant's heart, and shares a Passover meal with them. He institutes the Lord's Supper, or as we might know it, communion, and concludes by giving them powerful words of encouragement. He tells them to love one another as he has loved us. That, in essence, is the embodiment of all of Christ's commandments. He wants us to be people moved and mobilized by love. He knew that this would be their last meal together before his death, and he wanted to prepare them for the days ahead. At the conclusion of the meal, Jesus takes his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane, a place they had often gone to together. The garden was nestled at the foot of the Mount of Olives, a lustrous hill filled with olive groves. The spot was also filled with highly sought-after tombs as a place to honor lost loved ones with a beautiful final resting place. With the irony not lost to Jesus, this was the place he would share his final moments with the disciples before his betrayal, arrest, and crucifixion.
The brook Kidron carried the blood of sacrifices spilling from the temple. The water was crimson, cutting through the garden like an open wound. Judas led the detachment of soldiers through the garden. They stopped at a hedge. It hid them slightly, although their presence was indeed known by now. They looked over the hedge and saw a group of men talking to each other at a distance. The moon's silvery gleams were hidden behind storm clouds. Malchus nudged Judas and pointed forward.
It's dark. How will we know which man to arrest? We can't all spring out at once.
I will greet him with a kiss. One final time.
Judas replied with a tinge of remorse. His jaw was clenched, and his palms were sweaty. He was clearly in agony.
The man I greet with a kiss on the cheek is the one you will arrest.
They watched the group closely. One of them stepped forward. He marched over the brook Kidron. His stride was deliberate, like an arrow pointed toward a target.
There he is,
Judas whispered under his breath. He stepped out from the shadows. Judas appeared like a wolf sauntering out of its den. There, under the moon's faint glow, the wolf and the lamb stood yards away from each other. Hiding the cowardice between an insincere smile, Judas approached his master and greeted him.
Hello, Rabbi,
he said, accompanied by a kiss.
That's the one.
Malchus pointed at Jesus and looked back at the soldiers.
Prepare yourselves!
The small army emerged from the shadows behind Judas, armed and ready to attack. Jesus looked deeply into Judas' eyes. Sorrow, authority, and understanding anchored his voice.
So this is how you betray the Son of Man, with a kiss.
Jesus looked over Judas' shoulder and gestured to the soldiers behind him.
Whom do you seek?
Malchus was suddenly nervous. There was a strange shift in the air, as if the garden itself was a companion of Jesus. He no longer felt in control. The feeling vexed him even more.
We seek Jesus of Nazareth.
Jesus' eyes reflected the torches.
I am he.
As Jesus answered, something stirred among the heavens and the earth. Thunder rumbled, lightning streaked across the sky, and the mighty winds of God billowed against the soldiers with ferocity, pushing the men off their feet and onto their backs. Malchus flew back with them, hitting the ground and losing his breath. The men were quick to recoil and spring back to their feet, flustered and confused. Some drew out their swords, but others cowered back in confusion. Jesus, still calm, asked again,
Whom do you seek?
Malchus, shaky and uncertain, replied,
We seek Jesus of Nazareth.
I have already told you that I am he. All I ask is that you let my friends go. They have done nothing wrong. It is me you want.
Jesus stretched out his hands to be bound. Malchus and a few soldiers inched forward with trepidation, swords drawn, but trembling in their hands. But before they could take a complete step, one of Jesus' followers shouted,
You will not take him!
Malchus' eyes widened when he saw the large man approach. His sword was drawn and raised to strike. Malchus quickly lifted his sword to parry. The man hopped back, then swung downward again, aiming at Malchus' head. Malchus turned his body to dodge, but the sword grazed his ear and chopped it off. Malchus cried out and fell to the ground, holding his bloodied head and writhing in pain. His entire body shook with shock. The other guards jumped onto the man. He kicked and screamed with his sword in his hand.
Master, run!
But Jesus didn't run.
Peter, drop your weapon. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. You have seen my power. Do not think I could have my Father send legions of angels to fight on my behalf. What is happening must happen for the scriptures to be fulfilled.
Jesus calmly walked toward Malchus. The guards raised their swords, but Jesus raised his hands and assured them he meant no harm. He slowly bent over and picked up Malchus' bloody ear from the ground. Malchus whimpered in the dirt. A rush of hatred boiled up within him. He hated what Peter had done to him. He hated Jesus, too. He didn't ask for any of this. He was just following orders. He was being a good servant.
Caiaphas was right about them. They're dangerous. They're unhinged.
The blood dripping from Malchus' head was boiling with rage. Jesus approached with Malchus' ear in his hand. He raised it to Malchus' head.
Get away from me!
Bitterness and hatred bled out of Malchus. But Jesus remained calm. He gently brought Malchus' ear to his head and whispered something unintelligible. Everything was muffled and muted to Malchus. The winds shifted, and the leaves hushed to some unfamiliar tune. Then Jesus removed his hand from Malchus' head. Miraculously, his ear had been put back in place. Malchus touched his ear and looked up at Jesus. He didn't see a criminal armed for revolution. He saw a healer, armed with a warm smile, an understanding gaze. Jesus extended a hand to Malchus. He accepted it, and Jesus helped him to his feet. The guards released Peter, and the rest of the disciples ran away, fearing for their lives. They scattered like rats. Jesus raised his voice to the guards, completely controlling the situation.
Daily I taught in the temple, but none of you arrested me then. Why? I will tell you. This is how it must be for the word to be fulfilled.
With those words, Jesus raised his hands for them to bind him. The guards sprang into action, passing Malchus with clubs and rope. They shoved him to the ground, beat him, and tied him up. They dragged him away, but Malchus remained there. He watched them take Jesus, but from his angle it seemed Jesus was taking them. Malchus knew then that Jesus was not a victim or a powerless captive. He held his hands up to his ear and followed them. Malchus was still unsure who Jesus was, but he was determined to hear every last word he had to say.
Let's be honest for a moment. Life with other people, in whatever capacity, is messy. And this reality is no different for the people of God. Though the church is a vibrant community filled with God's love, it's also composed of imperfect people. As a pastor, I've had a few people come up to me and say, the church is filled with hypocrites. And my answer to that is, well, it's filled with a lot worse than hypocrites. You see, the church is made up of imperfect people, face-planting through life, desperately reaching for God. Though we aim to show everyone the tender care and love of God, there are times when we honestly fall short. And the people who are on the receiving end of that are often left hurt, bruised, and scarred. The term coined today is church hurt. People who have grown up in the church or entered into the doors of church and had a traumatic and bad experience. Whether it was the hypocrisy of leadership or passive-aggressive comments or insults, their experience with God's people left a bad taste in their mouth and, as a result, really cut off their ears to hearing the gospel. Such is the experience of Malchus, a temple guard who finds himself at the wrong end of Peter's sword. Hurt by one of Jesus' followers, he projects his pain and anger onto the Lord himself. There are many Malchuses in our world, people who have been cut off from hearing the gospel because of cutting words or betrayal from a member of the church. Countless individuals have found themselves wronged in the name of God. But our story reminds us that those who have been hurt by the church and God's people don't have to remain hurt. Though people may harm us, Jesus wants to heal us. Our story begins with Judas's private meeting with Caiaphas, the chief priest of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. This was the moment he locked in his decision to betray Jesus, the man who he once called a friend. Caiaphas sends Judas with a large detachment of Roman soldiers and officers from the temple guard. Though they may not have known what to expect in apprehending Jesus, they were going to prepare themselves for anything. They weren't going to let Jesus continue to spread his message any longer. As they enter the garden, they're faced with Jesus and his ragtag team of disciples. No armies formed from the masses ready for revolt, no mobs waiting to be set loose with violent revolution. Just 12 men enjoying the calm of the night. This quickly changes, though, when Peter jumps into action to defend Jesus and cuts off Malchus's ear. Peter likely thought he was taking an incredible leap of faith to defend Jesus. The only problem is, Jesus doesn't need us to defend him. Just moments prior, Jesus had just sent the troops flying onto their backs. Peter's act of boldness, as noble as it might have seemed on the surface, wasn't what the Lord was calling him to do. It's unfortunate to see Peter in this place. Peter allowed his own inflated sense of importance get in the way. Maybe Peter's heart was in the right place, wanting to protect his teacher. The wrong actions taken with the right motives are still wrong. What Peter didn't understand is that people aren't the enemy. God calls us to prepare for battle, but it's not a battle against people. Ephesians 6:10 says this, "We do not battle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." We have one enemy, and that's Satan, the one who stands opposed to God's will on every front. This is why Jesus rebukes Peter in the way that he did in Matthew 16. People aren't the enemy. The ones who are opposed to Jesus are lost. We can't view people with disdain and contempt. We have to see them with eyes of compassion. I have seen many people caught up in the same delusions as Peter. You see, Peter thought that Jesus needed his defending. He thought that somehow, some way, God, the creator of the universe, the master of the stars and the heavens, the one who crafted and formed the cosmos, somehow needed his sword. Peter was gravely mistaken, and it was an overinflated ego and sense of importance that had caused him to hurt someone. I think about how many people in my life I have cut off from hearing the gospel because I was harsh or judgmental or mean. Sometimes we get so lost in our zealous mission that we forget that we're supposed to love people. I think about all the people that I have hurt and all the ears that Jesus has had to put back. Perhaps you find yourself in a place like Malchus today. Perhaps you've darkened the doors of a church, or you've been a part of the church your whole life, all to be hurt by someone. Someone's cutting or judgmental words have left a scar. They've left you from hearing truly the love of Jesus. Today, know that the imperfections and self-righteousness of some of Jesus' disciples doesn't necessarily reflect Jesus himself. Look at the gospel. Look at the story of Jesus. Does he seem like the type of person who wants to cut off your ear and shove you aside? Or is he the type of person to mend what's been broken and restore you so that you can be an agent of change, love, healing, and justice in this world? Don't let the self-righteous, don't let the pompous, and don't let the zealous bring you down. Be an example to them, an example of love, an example of courage, an example of temperance, and an example of forgiveness. As we learned in some of our previous episodes, Peter is continually wrestling with his identity, and this is going to be an action he is going to have to repent from and really wrestle with. People are going to go through their own process of redemption, and Jesus is going to take them through that process. But as for you, find healing and find restoration today. If you've been caught in a flurry of self-righteousness, thinking that God somehow needs you to own all the atheists or to prove every single person wrong, don't get it backwards. God doesn't need your defending. He needs your devotion, and he needs you to walk with love, compassion, mercy, and truth to be a blessing to the people around you instead of a hindrance. Thanks again for listening to the Jesus Podcast. We're going to keep rolling with more outcast stories and then gracefully go into a whole new series on the miracles of Jesus. Can't wait.